Thank you much. There's two things that have just happened that have made me realize that I'm over the hill. The first is I woke up this morning thinking, oh, I got to make sure they get a new bio for me, and then I promptly forgot 10 minutes later. So quick corrections. Since the time I submitted a bio for this conference, I've become executive director of AmeriSpeak, so I'm no longer the chief scientist. Ting Yang, who's here, is the chief scientist, and as well, I'm no longer director of the Center for Panel Survey Sciences because I have to do AmeriSpeak things, and EPEC is the director. Which just absolutely thrilled that both Ting and EPEC are in these roles. The other realization I had this morning of realizing I was over the hill is yesterday in the experts panel, I tried to be provocative, and I didn't really, just kind of, I'm just going to tell people what I think. And I realized today in my keynote, it's the same sort of thing. It's like one of those things, I guess, when you get to a certain age, it's like, I don't care what people think. I'm just going to spit it out, and sucks to be you if you don't like it. So
don't rub it in as much. Okay?
Yeah, that's right. So in any event, now that I've set myself up for great success here, I do want to talk about transparency in probability panels, and there is a deck. Here it is. All right. All right. Well, 15 years ago, one might say, was really the beginning of the modern era in transparency and reproducibility in science. It was at that time that James Heathers put out a very eye-opening report. He claimed that 1 in 7 scientific papers may be based entirely or in part on fictitious data or fraudulent results. And this was quite a shock, 1 out of 7. But the exact percent of research that contains fraudulent results has since been studied by many, and depending on who you ask, the answer is very different, but nevertheless, it's not 0. Arguably because of these reports, and assisted really by technology and our ability these days to place data in the public sphere more easily than ever before, it really generated a substantial push to commit to scientific transparency and trying to really push for reproducibility. One of the most consequential outcomes, perhaps, of this effort was Science Magazine developing the TOP. TOP is the Transparency and Openness Promotion Guidelines. No fewer than 100 first-tier scientific journals and dozens of organizations have supported these guidelines. Nowadays, researchers working with quantitative survey data as well, if you're publishing to a first-tier journal, you're probably starting to finally getting used to the fact that you got to make sure your data is in a public repository, signing affidavits and letters assuring the transparency and honesty of your work. These are prerequisites nowadays to be considered for publication in a lot of the best journals in the world. In survey research, however, providing data and coding to journals is kind of akin to giving the cake, but not really explaining fully the ingredients or the proportions of those ingredients that went into making that cake. And it's not to suggest that the field has been completely devoid of transparency in its methods. In 2014, of course, APOR had the Transparency Initiative. Survey research organizations who join the Transparency Initiative commit to providing, quote unquote, disclosure elements of surveys when results are publicly released. These minimum disclosure elements to be included in each firm include data collection, reporting on data collection strategy, the research sponsor, noting the research was probability-based. You can see the list there of all the things that they ask you to provide. However, there's real great leeway in how and with what detail organizations have to actually provide the features of this research. You can imagine, for example, weighting, somebody just saying, well, we weighted by age, sex, education, done. Other people explaining their trimming procedures and what kind of iterative proportional fitting, and were there interactions, and what were the targets, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of leeway there. One might argue that, despite the TI being a great step forward, its efforts really culminated in a set of compromises. The goal of the TI was to get organizations to join. And if they set the bar too high, organizations weren't going to join. And to say, perhaps unpopular statement number one, APOR, and again, I'm a former president. I love APOR more than anybody. When the rules are developed by the people who have to follow the rules, there is an inherent conflict of interest baked into the process. You can't avoid that. More critically and noteworthy, the landscape of survey research has changed tremendously since the TI. Back in the inception of the TI, telephone surveys were the predominant methodology. Nowadays, sorry, let me go back. Telephone surveys, you got to work for me. Here, we'll go this way. There we go. Telephone surveys. Yeah, exactly. Have gone to the age of the dinosaurs, essentially. Interviewing with actual interviewers has really declined in frequency. Non-probability has arisen as one of the dominant methodologies across all survey research landscape. Online and multi-purpose probability panels have proliferated and substantially increased their market share. Of course, we're at CIPHER. I want to focus on probability panels. And you can see here, and I have to apologize because I'm sure there are quite a few that I've missed in my logos there. As research methodologies evolve and become ever more revolutionized, what's required to meet reasonable transparency needs to advance as well. A relatively useful parallel is perhaps automobiles, which are in their own revolution, hitches and pauses all included in that, but nevertheless in an irrevocable revolution themselves. Electric vehicles do not need to disclose their engine displacement, their miles per gallon of gasoline, or even the kind of transmission they have, because these metrics are completely irrelevant for electric vehicles. At the same time, if you're going to buy an EV, if you don't know the battery size and kilowatt hours and the charging voltage capacity, you have no idea how far that car is going to go and how fast it's going to charge. I mentioned cars because we see cars on the road and, they kind of all look the same, gasoline or electric. They're just cars, underneath. There's a lot that's the same, right? Wheels, seat belts, these things don't change. But there's an awful lot that's different, right? Transmissions, batteries, the very engine itself. And so it's true in survey research. Cross-sectional telephone surveys, cross-sectional online surveys, non-probability panel surveys, probability panel surveys, they have a lot in common, but they have an awful lot that's very different. And so it follows that while the TI did a great job back in 2014, an adequate, though perhaps not comprehensive, setup of transparency disclosure for survey research, it was really done again with the predominant methodology of the day, telephone surveys, and it's really not adequate for the evolving methodologies of today. And such is the case with probability panels. I'd note, I want to focus today on probability panels because, this is CIPHER. So, of course, right? Transparency and non-prob panels, kind of a contradiction in terms and beyond the scope of what I want to talk about today. Probability panels have a wide variance in what they report. This is just a sampling of some of the panels out there and showing some of the diversity in the different things that they report. For the most part, users of these panels only really know a few ingredients of the total recipe, certainly not any of the proportions used in the ingredients. Yet the result in all this is a field that purports transparency, but I would argue today doesn't really sufficiently practice it. The great wealth of scientific work being conducted on a daily basis with probability panels, culminating in literally hundreds of academic and government studies and foundational studies, et cetera, media studies, don't actually have oftentimes knowledge of the key metrics, such as uniformly calculated response rates, information on respondent behavior, how panelists were exactly recruited, how many might have attrited since recruitment occurred, precisely how the panel and the study were each given survey weights, and a lot of other key features. Even those who've executed the study themselves might report sufficient detail, but it's almost always the case that if the sponsor is someone else, the reports that those sponsors make do not often provide any reasonable detail. You get this little, 3-sentence methodological blurb at the end of the report, and it's difficult. I'll opine now, and you'll see as we come now a little later. Kind of nostalgic to the days of just doing cross-sectional telephone surveys. First of all, there's all this amazing knowledge in my head that's now like completely useless. But that's number of call attempts and dispositions by call attempts and all these fun things we used to research. But it was really quite simple. You drew a sample, you made phone calls, you waited. Probability panels have really jumped up a whole nother level in complexity. And so, while the TI, again, has made strides, it hasn't really kept up with evolving methodologies. And by the way, when I talk about the top before the transparency and openness promotion guidelines, not a single survey research journal is on that list of following those best practices for transparency. To identify the ways in which probabilities need to be transparent, let's, of course, talk about the ways in which probability panels differ from historic cross-sectional, predominantly telephone surveys. The most obvious difference, of course, is we do two stages, right? We need a minimum of 2 contacts. Respondents have to first get recruited, and then once they're recruited, they're going to start taking surveys. And, not only is the first stage non-existent in a typical cross-sectional survey, but with regard to probability panels, this is the stage we really need to be transparent about, and yet we tend to be the least transparent about. Because, we've talked about it here already today, typical 4% response rate, 4% response rate. That's typically panels get a recruiting rate of, about 4%. And then when people do their surveys, the panelists do their surveys, maybe that cooperation rate ranges, depending on who you're picking, between 30 and 65%. So you can see where all the non-response is happening, right? All the non-response is happening in the recruiting stage. And yet this is a stage that often isn't really talked about with a great deal of transparency. Get back to where I was. Yeah, so it's important to also note that recruitment stage also has multiple stages of its own. It's very typical that there's an empanelment stage, and then there's a profiling stage. It's typical, though not always the case, that recruits don't become fully fledged panelists until they get through all of these stages. And so again, there's a lot to know about what's going on in each of these stages. The second difference, perhaps less apparent, but quite substantial, is time, right? Panels live across time, and that has a number of implications for transparency. The first of these is noted above. Recruiting doesn't happen once with panels. It happens again and again and again. Some panels have a couple of waves a year. Some panels kind of do it in an ongoing basis, but even when they're ongoing, they're doing it with batches of replicates. So Notably, it also may be the case that each of these recruiting stages will use differential strategies. I know with Amerispeak, we've had years we've tried to stress Spanish speakers, and we changed things up to do that. A couple of years ago, we tried to oversample extreme Republicans to make sure we weren't too blue. Every year we're doing different things to try and maximize, reduce systematic non-response in our panelists. So there's a lot more detail there that needs to be disclosed, of course, as well. What are some of the things that we may think about, of course, in the recruitment stages? Of course, there's what kind of incentives you're using, the timing and sequence of your efforts, the kinds of mailings, the designs of your materials. There's just a lot of information there. And all of those choices that we make have implications on coverage, measurement, and non-response errors. Another implication of time is attrition. We've seen, in some respects already, attrition in recruitment can happen at multiple stages of empanelment. And further, panelists may complete all their necessary phases of empanelment and never do a survey. This is something, at least in Amerispeak, we call backouts. And this is, dirty little secret of the panel world, right? An awful lot of people back out. They join the panel and then they never do a survey. They take the money and run. We're not talking about 3 or 4 or 5%. It's not atypical for 20, even 30% of people who join a panel to never actually do a client survey. So there's that kind of attrition. And then, of course, there's, for non-backouts, panelists, of course, at some point will cease doing surveys. Amerispeak is 10 years old. Knowledge Panel's even older than that. We shouldn't expect these people to be doing surveys for 20, 30 years. It's okay, right? So they will attrit at some point, and that there's no reason to fear disclosing that. But then, of course, there's attrition of just gradually reducing cooperation rates. It's very typical. Panelists join, they're all jazzed up. Their participation rate for invited surveys is 60, 70, 80%. And then you look at them 2 years later, and they've settled into about 30% for the long haul. So there's a lot of different stages of attrition. And all of those stages and all of those characteristics of attrition, I would argue, we really don't talk about in a transparent way. And of course, they all have implications, or potential implications, at least, on the data quality provided by our surveys. Thus far, we've mainly talked about special implications of panel recruitment, which is, totally novel to panels compared to cross-sectional surveys. But the survey stage also includes multiple differences from cross-sectional surveys, and those have transparency implications as well. Perhaps the most consequential of these is among the sample who's invited to participate in a survey, who among those is getting invited to actually do a survey amongst all panelists. With cross-sectional surveys, simple random sampling or some level of stratification is typical. And when stratification is used, it's very limited in cross-sectional surveys because we don't really know a lot about the people we're surveying in a cross-sectional survey. In a panel, we know a lot about our panelists. And so there's a lot of potential avenues to sample for specific surveys non-randomly. Again, these need to be disclosed, but perhaps the most significant of these is when we sample for surveys just including active panelists, which is typically defined perhaps as a panelist that's done at least one survey in the last 6 or 12 months. At issue here is not whether it's not only clear that a survey sample has been winnowed down to only active panelists, but then indeed, if all sample that was used originally to attempt to recruit respondents is actually included in the response rate denominator. That is, simply put, are you really counting your non-active panelists in that denominator? Because at the end of the day, you did sample them, they did join, and just because you didn't invite them to a specific survey doesn't mean they don't get to count in that response rate. This is a case of selective transparency, if you will. and can lead researchers and consumers to really misunderstand the full response of a given survey. So let's talk about particular features of probability panels to make a starting argument that I'd like to put forward today of how we should be transparent. Starting with recruiting. First of all, sampling. We should be disclosing in our recruitments the sample sizes we use, the sample frames we use. If there are given, again, there's going to be more than one recruitment. Do these strategies change over time? For each of those, you could kind of foresee like kind of a technical document that discloses for each recruitment wave exactly what happened in that wave. Number two is methodology, the recruitment methodology. Disclosing modes within each mode, the details of recruiting. An example is, push to web recruiting would necessitate the disclosure of the number of mailings, the type of each mailing, the contents of each mailing, the incentives used and promised. And again, if strategies change over time, these should be documented. If a panel recruits secondary members are when a panel decides, oh, maybe there's also someone else in a household that we might want to be a member as well as the primary member. That should be disclosed as well. If a panel covers the non-internet population, panels should, of course, disclose the solution they've put forward and executed for covering that non-internet population. Finally, panelists should document how they refresh data from recruited panelists, from periodic checks of contact information like address to profile information such as political party identification, right? Panels, at least best practices, should be refreshing this information. Party ID is a perfect example, right? There's an awful lot of people whose party ID 2 years ago is actually different today in the United States. So asking it once is not a sufficient practice. With regard to weighting in recruitment, panel recruiting, again, often has complex sample strategies. And so it's very typical that panels will create a panel weight or a base weight for the recruitment stage of their work. That base weight or panel weight stage might include some general base weighting, non-response weighting, sample balancing. So all of this should be disclosed as well. Finally, when it comes to recruiting, thinking about recruitment rates and cohort data, panels should provide full details, of course, of the response at each stage. It is important to note, right, APOR sanctions essentially 4 response rates. There's the recruitment rate, there's the profile rate, the survey cooperation rate, and then the multiplicative of all 3, which is the final response rate of any given survey. But importantly, panels should also, I would argue, disclose an attrition rate. The attrition rate was something that De Soger and Caligaro documented in a very good paper in 2015, noting that panels have attrition, and it has been the practice in the past that when panelists get retired or attrit out in some ways, they somehow kind of, again, disappear from the denominator of these calculations. And they argued that, no, they were sampled, we need to have them in there. And they achieved that by establishing an attrition rate. If panels do forcibly retire folks, fine, disclose the method or decision point you have for retiring your panelists. I would also encourage panels to, provide information on all the information they profile on their panelists. Typically, this is done, most panels do have panel books that they have available on their website. Criteria for membership, quick one here. What do panelists have to do to become full-fledged members of their panel? Sign a privacy policy, of course. Do they have to answer profile questions? Is that mandatory or voluntary? Or maybe there's a criteria of if they've at least answered X number of profile questions, they get in. Again, I think panel attrition is a big one. And a number of us, I don't know if I see John here, but John was part of it, Krosnick, and some of others of us were part of this think tank for the Sunny Lands that Arthur Lupia and Kathleen Hall Jameson organized about sort of larger issues of transparency and good science in survey research. And there was kind of a subgroup, Michael was there as well too, that focused a little bit on panels, and panel attrition was a really big topic because, again, it was sort of identified as something we don't talk about a lot. Panels should document attrition of their panelists. Examples might be, talking about your back out rate, your drop off rate, who's retired, was it voluntarily or forcibly? Even better, maybe this is done by recruitment cohort. Panels should detail communication channels to panelists as well. Do they have help desk? Do they have portals? Do they have an app? Are there other methods of communication? Panel size. Panel size is a big source of confusion in panels. Typically panel organizations like to report, and just to be clear, like I'm one of them, so I do this too. We like to report that big number, that big fat number. Here's all the panelists we've ever recruited. Wow, Amerispeak currently is 80,000 panelists strong. Okay. Well, unfortunately, there's a lot of detail missing here, and there's a couple of numbers that would be far more useful. The first is active panel size, right? How many panelists have taken a survey in the last X months? In Amerispeak, we kind of flip. It should be 6, should it be 12? We don't really know. We kind of use both and just take a look at it. But that's really much more of an informative number. And another metric, again, I need to trademark some of these terms before they, like three-peat, they become fabulously wealthy by trademarking them. But we use a term in Amerispeak called effective panel size, which is to multiply each panelist by their last 6 or 12-month cooperation rate. And when you get a sum of that, basically you're getting a number that's telling you, if I invited every panelist to a survey today, how many interviews would I get? I think that's a really critical number and a good number to be, again, transparent about if possible. All right, moving on to the second stage, doing actual surveys. A lot of these are pretty low bar. Panels should disclose their standard methods of sampling members in the surveys. This is typically, well, I actually don't know because I don't see a lot of other panels talking about this. Amerispeak divides their panel members in the 48 unique strata by age, education, race, ethnicity, and gender education. I missed one of them. Ben did this earlier. I swear to God, every time I say the big four, I forget which ones I say, and then and I've seen so many other people do it as well. But you get the point. You divide the sample by your big four, you get 48 strata, and you sample randomly within each one, proportionate to probably population and the maybe last 6 or 12-month cooperation rate. Fine, great thing to be transparent about. In methodology, of course, executing surveys should be transparent. Often, despite all this crazy complexity we're talking about today, inviting panelists to do surveys sometimes is the easiest thing of them all, right? Like, okay, we'll just shoot them a couple of emails, or if they're non-COWI, a couple, and you're doing telephone as a solution, a couple of phone calls and call it a day. But nevertheless, it's nice, and it would be nice to even disclose what's your typical cadence for emails, for texting, for phone calls. Do you send an email on day 1 and then day 3 on a standard survey, et cetera? Weighting, really similar to cross-sectional surveys here, and I think most panel firms do their part, disclosing their methods, their weighting targets, whether they trim, and other features as well. Response rates, I feel I've been through already a little bit. Again, just reiterating, there's a number of different rates. There's the 3 sub rates. APOR says if you want to be part of APOR you should be reporting, and then the product of those three, but as well adding an attrition rate in there as well, I think is really critical to make sure that denominator is right. And then finally, I threw in here just for fun, suboptimal responses. If you do attention checks, it's not something that we do. Actually, EPEC helped co-write, and on the Center for Panel Survey Sciences, we have a little white paper on why to not do attention checks, but in panels at least, probability panels at least. Non-prop's another story. There's a lot of other things we want to think about, particularly the 3 S's, right? Speeding, straight lining, and skipping. How many of your panelists are doing these procedures? Do you have some sort of procedure to try and minimize these suboptimal behaviors? In a given survey, how many respondents did you weed out because they violated one of the rules of your suboptimal responses? So, again, knew I would come up here not trying to win a popularity contest and bringing up a lot of, what I think is a difficult topic for us. And when you look at this, again, I mean, I harken back to the days of telephone surveying. And it's like, wow, that was so easy. Like, our job now is so much more complicated in probability panels. We have so much complexity, and it's great stuff, right? Like, it's why I and probably most of you wake up in the morning is, we like this stuff. We like the complexity of it. And we think, and we know that we're building great scientific research tools with probability panels. So to me, there's really not anything to hide. I sort of made this argument yesterday that, in politics, when you're hiding something, that's when it becomes the opposition's best argument. It's very typical in politics that when you go full transparency, 2 weeks later, that thing's out of the news cycle and it never comes back. Probability panels are a unique type of survey tool with potentially great complexity, multiple stages of contact, complex procedures to recruit and retain and engage. Transparency in survey research, yes, it took a great step forward with the establishment of the TI. But as methods change, our standards for transparency, I would argue, must change with the times. I hope, that today my keynote address can serve as an initial blueprint for the disclosure of important methods, procedures, and practices in our panels. For probability panels to meet the standards of science, they must strive to be as transparent as possible, to instill trust in their methods and outcomes, for the best reproducibility, and just for good overall scientific practice. Transparency, we all learned back in Research Methods 101 in undergrad or grad school, right? Transparency is a critical tenet of the scientific method. It's a prerequisite to attain key scientific principle of reproducibility. And without the potential for reproducibility, one has insufficient trust in the results. Further, researchers looking to advance insight require transparency of past research in order to design their future research. It's very difficult to take that next step on the shoulders of the people before you when you don't really know what they did. Given past election results and other notable miscues in survey research, which have led to a declining trust in surveys, and given some of the current political environments where science is inherently distrusted, I would argue that now is the time to be as open and transparent as possible. We, all of us in this room, we all practice good science, and we do it for the public good. Furthering better policies and greater understanding of ourselves and our polity. We have nothing to hide. So let's set an example and shine a light as bright as possible on our own great work. Thank you very much.